Yes. Hi. Well, first of all, I want to thank to Natalie, Annalie, Holly, Tobias, and Mario for this amazing invitation. I'm really, really grateful to be part of Tilting Axis 3. I'm going to read, but I will try to explain a bit some images. I will try to be on time for these 20 minutes. Okay. This presentation reflects on the opportunities that archives offers to curatorial and research practices. I will share some specific ideas related to my own experience as researcher, writer, and curator. In the first place, I will try to contextualize the work of Red Conceptualismos del Sur, Southern Conceptualism's Network, a collective international platform that seeks to research and generate archives, as well to experiment with the reactivation of the local political memory. I will share some preoccupations regarding the situation of archives in Latin America that drove us to join together. And I think it's quite interesting to talk about this because I feel that has some resonances with Tilting Axis project. And secondly, I will comment a few projects developed in Theoretica, a visual art organization in Costa Rica, that can illustrate the role that archive has in some of our recent art historical and research projects. In 2007, a group of 6 researchers and art historians, including myself, co-founded Red Conceptualismos del Sur, Southern Conceptualism's Network. We met each other through our common interest in political narratives about Latin American art and our shared concerns about the unclear fate of important art archives in our region. My involvement began when I met art historian and writer Ana Longoni in Buenos Aires in August 2006. At that moment, I was immersed in research about early experimental practices in Peru, and where I came from actually, I born in Peru, and I found her essays and books on 60s avant-garde practices in Argentina encouraging and inspiring. Meeting Ana changed my understanding of art history as a framework for passionate commitment and political engagement. We didn't talk about creating a group at that time, but rather about how important it was to have exchange with colleagues doing similar research. In 2007, Ana was invited to contribute to a seminar at the MACBA in Barcelona. She invited myself and other 5 Latin American researchers to get involved in the public activities, which was when we founded the network. Southern Conceptualism's Network now includes more than 60 researchers, art historians, writers, and activists from different places. The network grew quickly. One of our first conversations was about Latin American conceptual art being in fashion. We were worried that new market demands could block the process of recuperating a constellation of experimental art practices developed under conditions of conflict, dictatorial regimes, and civil war. For us, contributing to the reactivation of these radical legacies implied not only politically positioned writing or curating, but it also required questioning how to generate conditions for the conservation of these materials in our own context. This was a very delicate situation in countries where artistic communities distrusted the existing governmental institutions because of their authoritarian and repressive past. We were worried that these materials would be lost. We felt that it was quite important to intervene in order to prevent the danger of dispossession and the physical loss of our documents. So we started thinking about how to trigger a larger discussion around the urgency to implement strategic responses and how to take collective responsibility for the care of material patrimony while involving local institutions. We wanted to collaborate with museums and universities to create public archives or loans for these archives, to move artist archives to the institutions and give them public access. Since 2008, Southern Conceptualism's Network has worked on some archives of artists whose work was fiercely positioned against military dictatorships during the 70s and 80s. We began our attempts to generate a new politics of preservation and public access in 2008 with the Uruguayan poet and artist Clemente Padín. We worked to convert his archive into a public center of documentation in Montevideo City, Uruguay. The project was born out of the artist's concern due to the recurring offers from private collectors to acquire his personal archive of experimental poetry and publications from the 60s and 80s. During those decades, Padín has been one of the main promoters of various editorial initiatives that built networks between Latin America, the United States, and Central and Eastern Europe at a time of harsh political repression. In 1977, Padín was detained by the Uruguayan dictatorship, and his archive was impounded, losing in the process many books, magazines, and works, which never were returned. The arrest prompted an extensive international protest campaign organized by the Mail Art Network that demanded freedom for Padín and his colleague Jorge Caraballo. This is one of the magazines that Padín edited in Uruguay. And this is one of the mail art pieces that circulated with the slogan, "Free Padín, Free Caraballo." After being freed in 1979, the artist began to reestablish contact with the Mail Art Network and to reconstruct his archive. In 2009, with the founding of the Reina Sofia Museum, the art historian Fernando David from Argentina and the Brazilian curator Cristina Freire, both of them founding members of our network, completed a diagnostic of his archive. Then we began conversations about the archive's custody with the General Archive of the Universidad de la República in Montevideo to guarantee a safe place for it, and adequate cataloging criteria that would assure his proper conservation and use. During this process, collaborating with the Reina Sofia Museum became a precedent for conservation policies different from those of conventional private acquisition, in which the material is usually displaced from its own original country. What our network seeks instead is to empower local institutions. Well, the Reina Sofia basically founded all the legal process, like hiring a lawyer to do all the paperwork to do this foundation, and also in infrastructure. So the idea was to keep the archive in Uruguay, which is quite different from other other policies when museums usually acquire the archive and move from their own context to, to the global north, for example. This first experience allow us, and by the way, and the Reina Sofia also keep digital copies of the materials that we digitize to public access. This first experience allowed us to implement similar projects in other cities. In 2011, we started working with the archive of Chilean activist art collective CADA, whose work was developed during the years of Pinochet's dictatorship in the 80s and 70s in Chile. The situation with this archive, consisting of photographs, documents, and remnants of artworks, was very particular, because the initial intention of his custodians was to sell it to an institution outside Chile, given their distrust of governmental institutions. In this situation, our job was to open a dialogue to imagine ways to keep the archive in Chile and to incorporate it into an institution, ensuring public access. After a difficult start, and with the collaboration of artists, Diamela El Tit and Lottie Rosenfeld, both of them founding members of CADA Group in Chile, the financial support from the Foundation for Arts Initiatives, and the institutional support, again, of the Reina Sofia Museum, some members of our network came to an agreement with the local institution, the Museum of Memory and Human Rights in Santiago de Chile. Thus, after a long first diagnosis and inventory of the material conducted by 4 members of our network, an important part of the archive moved on loan to this Museum of Memory and Human Rights Documentation Center. And next year, it will be moved to its final destination, the National Museum of Fine Arts in Santiago, in Chile. One more recent, this is another image of CADA, sorry. One more recent project is with the Peruvian-Swiss artist Francisco Mariotti and Peruvian artist Maria Lui, 2 of the most important figures of the art collective experiences in Peru during the 70s and 80s. This is a picture I took 3 years ago in his studio in Zurich. This is Francisco. Their archive, which includes silkscreen photographs, newspaper clippings, manuscript, video footage, among other materials, has been in Switzerland since 1982, following their decision to leave Peru. Our intention was for the archive to return to Lima. It's actually in Lima now. This is a picture from March. 2 months ago, they sent it from Zurich. It arrived in Lima 3 weeks ago. And the idea is to stay on long-term loan at the Lima Art Museum, a museum that is doing a remarkable work in the consolidation of the art scene, bringing together an important collection of contemporary art. In this case, the project involves the organization and digitizing of the material to assure its conservation and public access, but also an exhibition that I'm co-curating for 2019 at the museum. This is a picture from 3 weeks ago. We were in Lima. We were organizing the protocols to receive the archive. This is the library and the archive of the Lima Museum. And there is a curator of contemporary art and the librarian and 2 curators who are part of the committee who are in charge of taking care of the archive at the Mali, at the museum. The curatorial project will be based on the archival material, which help to trace some experimental practices that reshape the critical debate about social dimension of art. And I wanted to show it very, very briefly a web where we have when you can actually access to some of the materials that we already digitized. This is the CADA, for example, archive. There is some creative practice of the human rights movement in Argentina. There is a collection of cultural magazines during dictatorship in Chile, and this is the archive of Roberto Jacobi, a very important experimental artist in Argentina since the 60s. The web is Archivos en Uso, which means archives in use. It's .org, archivosenuso.org. Okay, thank you. Curating the archive. So, diving into the archives and patiently recovering forgotten materials give rise to a different way to conceptualize an exhibition, one in which waving narratives doesn't depend on conventional categories or established art figures. An example is the exhibition Losing the Human Form, a seismic image of the 1980s in Latin America, Perder la Forma Humana, una imagen sísmica de América Latina en los años 80, a reading of the 80s through the lens of creative social disobedience that we curated at the Museo Reina Sofía in Madrid in 2012. The project, which was also exhibited in Lima and Buenos Aires between 2013 and 2014, presented a vision of the tensions between art, politics, and activism that took place during the 80s in several Latin American territories. Through more than 600 works or materials, photographs, video, and sound recordings, to graphic and documentary material, as well as installation and drawings, the exhibition does invite to rethink a series of micro-narrative and specific case studies. The show evokes an image of the 1980s in Latin America that established a counterpoint between the effects of violence on bodies and the radical experiments in freedom and transformation which impugned the repressive order. Stricken bodies, mutant bodies between horror and festivity. The materials gathered show not only the consequences of mass disappearances and massacres under dictatorial regimes, stage of siege and internal wars, but also various collective urges to devise modes of existence in a permanent state of revolution. These exhibitions point out the multiple and simultaneous appearance of new ways of making art and politics in different parts of Latin America in that decade. It presents the result of an ongoing research project, which first phase was concentrated on certain artistic episodes from Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Brazil, and Peru, with the inclusion of some individual case studies from Mexico, Colombia, and Cuba. For us, the long decade of the 1980s began in 1973, the year of Pinochet's coup d'etat in Chile, and continues up to 1994, when the Zapatista movement inaugurates a new cycle of protests that relaunches activism at an international level. The period corresponds to the consolidation of neoliberalism as a new hegemony and the crisis of the traditional left. The exhibition renders this panorama complex by retrieving experiments with suggested forms of resistance through fragile supports like silkscreen, performance, video, poetic action, experimental theater, and participative architecture. These practices can be grouped in 3 main areas. The first is visual politics, driven by social movements like the Mother of Plaza de Mayo, as in this picture, in Argentina, and Mujeres por la Vida, Women for Life in Chile. The second is is acts of sexual disobedience, which includes queer activism that defies traditional construction of gender. The last is the underground scenes, which use music, partying, and do-it-yourself ethic to construct micro-communities and to make it possible to reestablish the social ties broken by authoritarian terror. A project like this, including 100 of elements, many of which has never shown before, was only possible because this specific project was comprised of more than 35 researchers working together to create a dialogue between the materials. Collaborative work, or collective curating in this case, is important because it offers a possibility to create transversal historical discussion that go beyond the limits of individual working. These are like some exhibition views of the project at the Reina Sofía Museum in Madrid. In fact, several episodes that we exhibited arose from sharing the material that we were finding in our visit to archives in several cities. An example of this is the case of the Movimento de Arte Pornó in Brazil in the early 80s during dictatorship. The research made by Fernanda Nogueira begins with an oral mention by the artist Mario Ramiro to André Mesquita, who was also a researcher of the project. Andrés shared the information with Fernanda, who was writing about practices of sexual dissidence in graphic and literary production. That was around 2010, probably. The appearance of the film Porn Poetry of 1982, which registers public action of the group, allowed to get in touch with some of its members and to reconstruct the collective work through photographs and oral testimonies. Until that moment, the work of this collective was scarcely known. Another advantage of working with archival materials is that they offer the opportunity to build narratives from other starting points that go beyond the usual suspects of Latin American art. We wanted to sink a moment of crisis, both in the social body and in the concept of art, which implied rethinking the categories with which that period has been interpreted. In fact, some opinions criticize the absence of big names in the show, like Luis Kamnitzer, Eugenio Dittborn, Sildo Meireles, Victor Gripo, Tunga, among others, which I think is a rather naive criticism, because clearly what interested us and what the archive offered was the opportunity to escape the canon. Our aim was to interpret the decade against the grain, to think about it from the vantage point of ignored materials, residual episodes, and semi-clandestine experiments that emerged as a result of new investigations. By including this variety of experiences of creative activism, both from artists and organized civil society groups, we were not interested in entering into the sterile debate about whether this may or may not be considered artistic, which was a minor issue for us. The notion of art is effective for the institution and for the market, but it is hardly useful to think of many creative practices that emerge from urgency and social commotion. What matters to us was how body construct politically powerful representation, capable of intervening and intensify social struggles. While it was a matter of asking questions to our history, we like to fantasize with the idea that these images can also interrogate and add new chapter to the history of politics itself. Even if we couldn't perceive it when we started to do this project in 2007, we were helping in shifting the value of artistic practice within Latin American institutions. That situation changed not only the social status of those documents, but also their economic value. The effects of a project such as Global Conceptualism in 1999, as well as some curatorial and scholarly initiatives focused on the 60s and 70s in Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, and Peru during those years, galvanized the desire to tackle metropolitan narratives and remap a set of priorities that until then organized the institutional policies of collecting and preservation. It is important to consider that 10 years ago, in 2007, when we started to push these discussions, the landscape was very different. Museums in Latin America weren't precisely interested in shaping the local memory through archives. Many Many were hesitant to acknowledge that this scarce documentation could actually represent an opportunity to complicate notions of education, access, collecting, and exhibition making. There were only a few archive initiatives that were introduced years earlier by the need of scholarly activity. Today, such policies now exist in large museums in the region, such as the MUAC in Mexico or the Mali in Peru, which are actively acquiring and incorporating archives with a clear understanding of its public effects. And I'm going to ask for 5 more minutes. Is okay? No? 2 minutes, okay. Yeah, I just wanted to share briefly how the archival practices are present in some of the work in Theoretica. Theoretica is a non-profit visual art organization founded in 1999 by Virginia Perez Raton, a Costa Rican artist and curator, and his mission is to contribute to the research and diffusion of contemporary art practice in Central America and the Caribbean in dialogue with global realities. Okay, so for the last 3 years, Theoretica has been organizing his own archive that include materials related to the history of the institutions, to contemporary art practices from Central America and the Caribbean, but also to the artistic, curatorial, and theoretical work of Virginia Perez Raton. Gabriela Sainz-Shelby, who is here, director of Theoretica, is leading the process of organizing the materials. Our intention is to actively involve local and international researchers in the construction of contemporary narrative, starting from the documents and materials that we institution helped to produce in almost 20 years of activities. We want to create a searchable database, both digitally, online, and also physically at our space, and to create grants for people that are interested in working with the archive. This is part of the archive videos that we have in the archive. Archival practice is also integrated with recent curatorial endeavors, such as in the project of the revision of Central American women artists that we started last year. In this case, it is more like curatorial intervention that seek to prevent that such bodies of work disappear historically. It is important for us to rethink how curatorial enterprises create possibilities to recontextualize discarded materials or to recognize and create value against the dominant male culture. In some cases, the valorization of art practices by some of these women artists wasn't fully created yet, as it is in the case of the Costa Rican artist Victoria Cabezas. Actually, part of her graphic work was discarded by the artist last Christmas because she thought they didn't have any relevance. This is a picture I took of the silk trim on metal at her kitchen the day she rescued it from the garage. They were covered with dirt and waiting for the garbage truck to take them. That was in January this year. Her work from early 70s addressed with humor the international politics of bananas to make a comment about sexual desire, commercialization of good and bodies, and the interdependence of the construction of masculinity, and concepts such as consumption and exploitation. I'm organizing an exhibition with her work that includes these unpublished materials, or as in the case of Nicaraguan artist Patricia Bailey, the curatorial project in this case oriented to organize her archive that included more than 500 slides and photographs of sculptures and work created since early 1980s, most of them lost and destroyed. We digitized half of them, which will be included in the monographic publication we are preparing in collaboration with Fundación Ortiz Gurdiaga in Nicaragua. The book accompanies the historical survey exhibition of Bailey's work from mid-80s that was organized by Theoretica last year, which traveled to Nicaragua. This is a picture from the installation in Nicaragua that opened in February this year, and it will continue to Guatemala this August, and I'm finishing now. But archive is also present in the organization of experimental exhibitions like the one that we opened 3 days ago at Theoretica entitled Let's Kiss All Together, the first historical and documentary revision of the history of LGBT movements in Costa Rica. The project, developed in collaboration with queer organization Frente por los Derechos Igualitarios, presents oral testimonies, video interviews, press clippings, photos, images, and works created by the local queer community, objects and materials used in public demonstrations, alongside a large number of quotes of sexual workers, trans, and feminist activists that illustrates how the struggle has changed in the 1950s to the present. We see this project as an open archive and as an invitation to collective building of history. Finally, the reactivation of the editorial program also tries to fill some historical gaps Last year, we launched Local Writings, Critical Position from Central America, the Caribbean, and their diaspora. It's a series of monographic bilingual books that collects key texts from a number of brilliant artists, writers, art historians, curators, and thinkers that contributed to the re-energizing the art scenes in their own context. The first two books were by Costa Rican curator Tamara Diaz Bringas and Panamanian art critic Adrian Samos. And this year we're publishing books that collect the text by Puerto Rican art historian Mari Carmen Ramirez and Guatemalan art critic Rosina Casali, and in the list is also Chris Cossier, by the way. But for some of the... No, I just wanted to mention that this is also the book we are preparing with Raúl Quintanilla in Nicaragua, and this is also include some archival materials that were never published before. So I'm going to finish here. Thank you.